Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. In the dim glow of the quantum portal, Elias Ardent stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the swirling, fragmented edges of reality before him. It wasn't chaos, as one might expect when tampering with the fundamental laws of existence. Instead, it was unervingly quiet. The universe had just absorbed his actions, his deliberate erasure from the annals of time, and yet it held its breath. There were no ripples, no cosmic backlash, no unraveling of the delicate threads that bound time together. It was calm, too calm. Elias's fingers hovered over the control panel of the temporal stabilizer, his chest rising and falling with deliberate precision as if he feared even his breathing might disturb the fragile equilibrium. The portal's glow, a blend of blues and silvers, reflected off the sweat on his brow. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, in theory, in simulations, in dreams, but none of it could have prepared him for the reality of what he had done. What happens when you delete your existence from history? The question echoed in his mind, no longer an intellectual exercise or a philosophical conundrum but a visceral, unavoidable truth. He was no longer born. The events that led to his creation, his parents' meeting, their shared memories, the pivotal moments that carved his place in the timeline, were gone, unmade by his own hand. The stabilizer emitted a faint hum, its intricate mechanisms working tirelessly to hold the portal steady. Elias couldn't help but wonder if it was futile, if even this advanced technology could stave off the consequences of such an act. The air around him seemed to shimmer faintly, not with heat but with something intangible, as though reality itself were waiting to decide what it should do with him. Time travel had been the pinnacle of human achievement. It was not the stuff of fantasy or speculative fiction. It was a precise science, controlled, regulated, and tightly monitored by the Chrono-Regulator Initiative. To manipulate time was to accept responsibility for its consequences, to understand that every step backward or forward left a footprint in the fabric of existence. And yet, Elias had ignored those warnings, sidestepped the laws, and crossed a boundary no one else dared to approach. His world was one of infinite possibilities, a future where quantum manipulation had replaced the limitations of the natural world. Entire cities thrived on chronal energy, and humanity's understanding of time had become so refined that it was no longer merely observed, it was navigated. Yet with such power came strict limitations, enforced by those who understood that meddling with time was not just a risk, it was a threat to everything. Elias had been among those enforcers once, a scientist and a guardian of the timeline. He had pledged to protect it, to ensure the sanctity of the past and the viability of the future. But even the strongest convictions could be eroded by personal loss, and Elias's loss had been unbearable. It was his mother's death that had set everything in motion, a senseless accident, a moment in time that could have been prevented if someone had interfered. For years, he had tried to live with the grief, with the knowledge that the technology to save her existed but was forbidden. He had watched others bend the rules for lesser reasons, political gain, financial advantage, personal ambition. Yet when it came to saving his own family, he had been told no. Desperation, guilt, and the ache of a love that transcended reason had driven him to this moment. The Temporal Manifesto, a relic from the earliest days of time travel research, had been his guide. It was a collection of theories and practices long abandoned by modern science, deemed too dangerous and unpredictable. But for Elias, it had been a beacon of hope. Through its forbidden pages, he had found the means to open this portal, to step back into the past, and to undo the moment that had stolen his mother from him. And now, the paradox was complete. In saving her, he had erased himself. The timeline where Elias Ardent had been born no longer existed. The universe had accepted his interference without resistance, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this calm was deceptive. The stabilizer continued to hum, its lights blinking in rhythmic patterns, and the portal remained stable. Yet Elias knew that something had to change. It was inevitable. He stepped back from the control panel, his movements slow and deliberate. His body felt lighter, as though the very essence of his existence was beginning to slip away. Memories flickered in and out of focus, fragments of his childhood dissolving like sand through his fingers. He closed his eyes, struggling to hold on to what remained. His mother's smile, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her hand in his when he was a child, they were all that mattered now. He opened his eyes again, looking into the swirling depths of the portal. Somewhere, on the other side, his mother was alive. She was safe. She would live a life free of the pain and loss that had shaped his. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder what this act of love would cost the universe, and whether the calm he felt now was merely the eye of the storm. The paradox had begun, and Elias was about to find out what happens when you rewrite the rules of existence. Elias Ardent was not the kind of man who sought power or recognition. He was, by every measure, a meticulous and disciplined scientist. In 2145, he worked at the Chrono-Regulator Initiative, an institution revered for safeguarding humanity's greatest achievement, the control of time itself. Their mandate was simple but absolute: ensure that the timeline remained intact, unaltered by human hands. In this world, where quantum manipulation had replaced old sciences, tampering with the past was not just forbidden, it was a crime against existence itself. Elias had dedicated his life to this cause, not out of ambition, but out of an almost obsessive sense of duty. He had seen what carelessness in the timeline could do. In rare, classified cases, unauthorized time jumps had led to cascading disasters. The disappearance of entire families, inexplicable environmental collapses, and even nations vanishing from historical records. These anomalies weren't erased, they left scars in the fabric of reality. It was the job of people like Elias to prevent these scars from forming. But for Elias, the mission was personal. Years ago, his mother's death had left an indelible mark on him. It wasn't a grand tragedy by the standards of history, just a car accident, one of the few dangers left in a world that had solved so many others. A faulty autopilot system, a fleeting moment of bad luck, and she was gone. He had been powerless to stop it, powerless to change anything. He was only 16 at the time, a boy who watched helplessly as the most important person in his life slipped away. The pain never left him. Not through his years of study, not through his climb to one of the most prestigious positions in temporal science. It lingered, growing quieter but no less heavy, a constant reminder of what he had lost. And as time passed, that pain evolved. It became something sharper, something that cut into his very identity. If time could be navigated, if the past could be observed with such precision, why was it so untouchable? Why were they allowed to see but forbidden to act? Elias had asked those questions before, but only to himself. The initiative's creed was clear: observation, not interference. To tamper with time was to invite chaos. He had accepted this rule until the day he found the Temporal Manifesto. The discovery was unintentional, or so he told himself later. He had been cataloging old research from the early days of time travel, a task assigned to him after a recent breakthrough in stabilizer technology. Most of the documents were harmless, outdated equations, primitive theories long since disproven. But then there was the manifesto. It was a relic from a time when the rules of time travel had not yet been written, when researchers had pushed boundaries without understanding the risk. The manifesto detailed methods for unregulated time travel, methods that bypassed the safeguards built into modern stabilizers. It spoke of loopholes in quantum mechanics, ways to mask temporal interference, and, most importantly, how to manipulate fixed points in time, moments previously thought immutable. Elias read it in secret late at night when the lab was empty. Its pages, digital yet somehow aged, were both a revelation and a temptation, and as he read, one idea began to take shape, a seed of hope buried beneath years of grief. He could save her. He could go back, correct the course of history, and undo the tragedy that had defined his life. but with hope came fear. The manifesto was clear about the risk. Time was not linear as it defies comprehension. To alter one thread was to risk unraveling others. And then there was the paradox. Elias knew what it meant to save his mother. It would change everything that followed, including his own existence. Without her death, he would never have joined the initiative, never have found the manifesto, never have stepped into the past. His birth, his very presence in the timeline, depended on events he was about to erase. He should have stopped there. The logical part of him, the scientist, knew the risk. But the son, the boy who had stood by the side of a hospital bed, powerless to change anything, could not let it go. The paradox became less of a deterrent and more of a puzzle, one he was determined to solve. Surely there was a way to stabilize the timeline, to rewrite a single event without collapsing the entire structure. Surely, he could be the exception. The only voice of reason came from Solis, his AI assistant, an advanced system designed to assist regulators like Elias in their work. Solis was programmed to anticipate human errors, to offer solutions, and, when necessary, to enforce compliance with initiative protocols. It warned him repeatedly as he began his preparations, its calm, measured tone a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Elias's mind. Unauthorized manipulation of fixed points is strictly prohibited, Solis reminded him one night as he calibrated the stabilizer. "I know," Elias replied, not looking up. "Probability of temporal destabilization exceeds 97%. I can compensate," Elias said, though he wasn't sure if he was convincing Solis or himself. "Elias, this course of action will result in—" "I don't care," he snapped, silencing the AI. He knew the consequences. He knew what he was risking. But the thought of doing nothing, of living another day knowing he could have acted, was unbearable. The night came when he was ready. The stabilizer was configured, its parameters set to the exact moment in 2128 when his mother's accident occurred. The portal shimmered to life, its edges rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. As Elias stepped closer, the hum of the machinery seemed to grow louder, resonating deep in his chest. The air was heavy, charged with energy, and every instinct told him to stop. But he didn't. Crossing the threshold was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Time itself seemed to bend and stretch around him, a sensation that was both exhilarating and terrifying. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no light, no sense of direction. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Elias opened his eyes to a world he had only seen in memories. The streets of 2128 were exactly as he remembered them, familiar yet distant, like stepping into an old photograph. The paradox had begun, but for now, the timeline held. The question was, how long would it stay that way? The transition through time was unlike anything Elias could have prepared for. One moment, he was in the controlled environment of the Initiatives lab. The next, he was thrust into the streets of 2120, a year before the accident that had defined his life. The air was denser, cooler, carrying faint scents of metal and rain, familiar, yet foreign after decades of progress in his own time. For a moment, he simply stood there, his breathing shallow, his mind racing to process the enormity of what he had just done. He was no longer a regulator, no longer bound by the laws of time. He was an intruder. The streets bustled with life, though the faint hum of autonomous vehicles and the flickering glow of augmented reality projections gave away the era. The city had changed since then, evolving into the polished, quantum-powered metropolis he knew in 2145. But here, in 2120, it retained its imperfections: cracked sidewalks, uneven lighting, and a faint haze of pollution clinging to the skyline. This was the world his mother had lived in, the world she had known. And somewhere in this city she was alive. Elias kept his head down as he moved through the crowd. He had memorized the layout of this district from the records, where she worked, where she lived, and the routes she took each day. But being here, surrounded by people who might unknowingly recognize his face or question his presence, made the journey feel precarious. His chronodisplacement tag, a faintly glowing device on his wrist, allowed him to blend into the time period's biometric networks, masking his temporal signature. Even so, it was not perfect. Any irregularity could alert the enforcers, those who patrolled the timeline for anomalies like him. He turned a corner, pulling the hood of his jacket tighter as he approached her workplace. It was a small clinic, unremarkable in its appearance but vivid in his memories. This was where she had worked tirelessly, where she had spent long hours caring for patients, balancing her duties as a nurse with raising her son. He paused across the street, his pulse quickening. He didn't need to check the time. He already knew her schedule. She would be leaving soon, walking the same path she took every day to the transport hub a few blocks away. And then, he saw her. She stepped out of the clinic, her pace brisk, her attention focused on the device in her hand. For a moment, Elias forgot where he was, forgot why he was here. He simply stared. She looked younger than he remembered, her movements more energetic, her face free of the lines that grief and time had etched into his memories. Her hair was tied back in a way he had seen countless times in old photos, but seeing her here, in motion, alive, it was overwhelming. He felt his breath catch in his throat. Every instinct urged him to call out to her, to run across the street and embrace her, to tell her everything. But he couldn't. He knew the risk. Any interaction could alter the timeline in ways he couldn't predict, ways the manifesto hadn't fully prepared him for. So he stayed where he was, watching her from a distance, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She paused at the corner, waiting for the pedestrian signal to change. A man approached her, a coworker perhaps, and they exchanged a few words. She laughed, a sound Elias hadn't heard in years. It struck him harder than he expected, a pang of longing that made his chest ache. He wanted to stay there forever, to watch her live, to absorb every detail of this moment. But he knew it wasn't enough. This wasn't why he had come. The memory of her accident loomed in his mind, vivid and unrelenting. He knew the exact date, the exact time, the sequence of events that had led to it. It wouldn't happen for another year, but the thought of her walking unknowingly toward that future filled him with dread. He had come here to change that, to rewrite her path. Yet as he followed her from a distance, keeping to the shadows, he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. The paradox was already in motion. Every step he took in this timeline carried consequences. As he tailed her through the streets, he noticed something he hadn't accounted for, anomalies in the patterns of the people around him. Subtle at first, but unmistakable. A man in a long coat seemed to appear at multiple intersections, his movements synchronized with Elias's path. A woman with a briefcase stood too still at a cafe, her gaze flickering toward him before shifting away. They weren't ordinary passers-by. They were enforcers, disguised but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. Elias's pulse quickened. He couldn't afford to be caught, not now, not when he was so close. He adjusted his pace, taking a detour through a narrow alley, careful to keep his distance from his mother while avoiding the enforcer's line of sight. The chronodisplacement tag on his wrist hummed faintly, warning him of the growing strain on its cloaking parameters. He needed to act quickly. As he emerged from the alley onto a quieter street, he spotted her again, just ahead. She had paused outside a small bakery, her attention drawn to the window display. For a moment, the enforcers seemed to fade from his mind, replaced by the sight of her, so ordinary, so human, yet so achingly important. He hesitated, torn between his fear of discovery and his overwhelming need to be closer to her. But then, the first misstep happened. A delivery drone, its route interrupted by a recalibrating signal, veered dangerously close to the sidewalk. Elias, instinctively reacting to the scene, stepped forward to intervene, his focus entirely on the potential collision. The movement was small, but it was enough. His actions drew the attention of the enforcers. Worse, the drone, its trajectory altered by his interference, clipped the side of a lamppost. The impact sent a shower of sparks onto the sidewalk, scattering pedestrians and causing his mother to stumble back in alarm. Elias froze, his heart pounding as he watched her recover, unharmed but shaken. The enforcers, now fully aware of his presence, began closing in, their disguises slipping as they activated their temporal trackers. He had put her in danger, however unintentionally, and now the timeline teetered on the edge of further disruption. He couldn't stay. Not like this. He turned, his thoughts racing as he plotted his next move. The timeline was already shifting, and the paradox was growing more unstable with every second. Elias moved quickly through the city streets, his mind racing with the realization of what had just happened. The drone's malfunction, the enforcers closing in, and the fleeting glimpse of his mother. These were not isolated events. Each moment felt connected, like threads tightening around him, pulling the timeline closer to instability. He kept his head down, blending into the flow of pedestrians, his thoughts a storm of guilt and determination. The stabilizer on his wrist buzzed faintly, a reminder of the tenuous balance he was now trying to maintain. The first signs of the paradox were subtle. At first, it was just a strange sensation, a flicker of something intangible. As Elias crossed an intersection, the world around him seemed to pause, a fraction of a second stretched unnaturally before snapping back into place. It was so brief that he thought he might have imagined it. But then it happened again. A street vendor's voice slowed, the sound warping before returning to normal. The holographic advertisements projected onto the buildings flickered, their images replaced by static before realigning. Elias stopped in his tracks, his breath catching as he realized what was happening. The timeline was reacting to him, not just to his presence, but to his interference. The stabilizer on his wrist blinked erratically, its hum growing louder as it struggled to compensate for the dissonance. He ducked into a narrow alley, pulling his jacket tighter as if that could somehow shield him from the unraveling forces around him. "Solis," he whispered, activating the AI. The familiar voice responded, calm but laced with urgency. "Elias, the displacement field is destabilizing. Your presence has triggered a temporal cascade." Elias leaned against the wall, his hand gripping the stabilizer. "Define cascade? How bad is this?" "Localized disruptions are expanding. The probability of full timeline collapse is increasing with each anomaly. You must leave this period immediately." Elias shook his head, his voice tight with frustration. "I can't leave yet. She's still in danger. I need more time." "Elias," Solis continued, "your interference has already initiated a paradox. The chronal dissonance you're experiencing is a result of your actions." It was then that Elias noticed something alarming. His hand, which had been gripping the stabilizer, seemed less solid. He stared at it, his heart pounding as faint traces of light flickered through his skin. The dissonance wasn't just around him, it was within him. He was becoming untethered from the timeline, his very existence slipping through the cracks he had created. The realization hit him with the weight of inevitability. Every action he had taken, every step he had made in this past, had consequences he couldn't fully control. The paradox wasn't just a theoretical risk anymore, it was unfolding in real time. His presence here, his attempt to rewrite history, was erasing the very foundation of his existence. The memories of his childhood, once vivid and clear, began to fade, replaced by an unfamiliar void. He struggled to hold on to them, to recall the sound of his mother's voice, the way she had smiled at him, but they were slipping away faster than he could grasp. "Solis," he said, his voice shaking, "if I'm erased, what happens to the timeline? Will it stabilize?" Solis hesitated, a rare occurrence for an AI designed to process infinite variables with precision. "The outcome is uncertain. Erasing yourself could resolve the paradox, but it could also destabilize the timeline further, leading to a collapse." Elias clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. There has to be another way. What about the manifesto? It mentions stabilization protocols. Is there something in the equations I missed? The protocols in the manifesto are incomplete, Solis replied. They were theoretical and never tested. Attempting to apply them now would carry significant risks. Elias pushed off the wall, his jaw tight with determination. I didn't come this far to let it all fall apart. There has to be a solution. There always is. He moved deeper into the alley, away from the crowded streets, his mind racing through the possibilities. The stabilizer continued to hum, its lights dimming and brightening as it struggled to maintain its hold on him. The dissonance grew stronger, waves of nausea and vertigo washing over him as reality warped and twisted around him. He could feel the timeline pushing back against him, rejecting his presence like a foreign object. As he stumbled forward, he caught sight of his reflection in a broken piece of glass on the ground. His face stared back at him, but it was incomplete. Parts of his features seemed to blur, fading in and out of focus like a poorly rendered image. He reached out to touch his face, his hand trembling as he realized the depth of what was happening. He was becoming a ghost, a shadow of a man who no longer belonged to this time, or any time. Solis's voice broke through the haze. Elias, you must stabilize the timeline before your displacement becomes irreversible. Failure to do so will result in complete temporal collapse. Elias gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening. I'm not giving up. Not yet. He activated the stabilizer's manual interface, his fingers moving quickly over the controls. The manifesto's equations were etched into his memory, and he began inputting the parameters for a recalibration. The process was complex, requiring precise calculations to counteract the dissonance. As he worked, the world around him continued to shift, fragments of reality bending and distorting like ripples on the surface of a disturbed pond. Warning, Solis said. Recalibration will temporarily amplify the dissonance. You may experience further disruptions to your existence. I don't have a choice, Elias muttered. Just keep the portal stable. He entered the final command, bracing himself as the stabilizer emitted a high-pitched whine. The air around him shimmered, and for a moment everything froze. The sounds of the city faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, with a sudden jolt, reality snapped back into place, the dissonance subsiding slightly. Elias exhaled, his body trembling from the effort. The stabilizer's hum returned to a steady rhythm, its lights stabilizing as it adjusted to the recalibration. He wasn't out of danger yet, but he had bought himself a little more time. The paradox was still unfolding, and the timeline remained precarious. But as long as he could hold on, as long as he could keep fighting, there was hope. And for Elias, hope was enough to keep him moving forward. Elias stood in the quiet alley, staring at the faint glow of his stabilizer. He had recalibrated the device, buying himself a fragile balance, but the dissonance hadn't stopped. His body still flickered faintly at the edges, a physical reminder that the timeline was rejecting him. Time itself seemed to resist his presence, each step forward weighted with the knowledge that he didn't belong. Yet despite the unraveling chaos within him, his purpose remained clear. He had come here for one reason, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. The accident. He knew exactly when and where it would happen. For years, he had replayed the details in his mind, torturing himself with the memory of what might have been. The faulty autopilot system in his mother's transport pod, the critical malfunction that left her helpless as the vehicle collided with a support column. It was a senseless, avoidable death, the kind that could be corrected if only someone had been there to intervene. Now, standing in the year 2120, Elias was determined to be that someone. He moved quickly through the streets, his mind locked on the coordinates of the accident. The stabilizer hummed faintly as he activated its tracking function, a pulsing light guiding him toward the exact location. The streets blurred around him as he walked, his focus narrowing to a single point in time, a single moment that would define everything. As he approached the intersection where it would happen, he felt a strange, oppressive stillness settle over him. The stabilizer's hum grew uneven, its lights flickering in irregular patterns. The timeline was already bending, reshaping itself in response to his actions. He paused at the corner, his heart pounding as he scanned the area. And then, he saw it. The transport pod was gliding down the street, its sleek frame illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. Inside, he could see her, his mother. She was focused on the control interface, unaware of the impending failure that would seal her fate. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight of her, alive and moving, so close and yet so far away. He stepped forward, his hands trembling as he adjusted the stabilizer. The moment was fast approaching, and he had to act. He couldn't allow himself to hesitate, not now. The memories of his childhood, her laughter, her warmth, the way she had held him when he was scared, flashed through his mind. But even as he clung to those memories, he felt them begin to fade, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The first signs of the malfunction became visible. The transport pod's lights flickered, and its trajectory wavered slightly. Elias knew what was coming. The autopilot system was about to fail, leaving the vehicle on a collision course with the support column. He glanced at the stabilizer, its display flickering with warnings of temporal instability. The paradox was reaching its breaking point. He sprinted into the street, the world around him warping and distorting as time itself fought against his presence. The stabilizer's hum grew louder, a high-pitched whine that seemed to resonate in his very bones. He reached the pod just as the autopilot failed completely, the vehicle lurching to one side as it veered off course. Without thinking, Elias slammed his hand against the emergency override panel on the side of the pod, forcing the vehicle to a sudden halt. The impact of his action rippled through the timeline like a shockwave. The stabilizer on his wrist emitted a sharp burst of light, and for a moment, the world seemed to fracture around him. Time loops and breaks began to form, fragments of alternate realities overlapping and colliding in his field of vision. He saw flashes of different outcomes, some where the accident still happened, others where it didn't. The paradox was unraveling, pulling at the fabric of existence with every passing second. Elias staggered back, his vision swimming as the dissonance within him intensified. His mother was safe, he had stopped the accident, but the cost was becoming painfully clear. His memories, the very essence of who he was, were unraveling. He could no longer recall the sound of her voice, the details of her face, or the moments they had shared. They were being replaced by echoes of a new timeline, a reality in which the accident had never occurred. He dropped to his knees, his breathing ragged as he struggled to hold onto what remained of himself. The stabilizer continued to hum, its lights dimming as it worked to stabilize the timeline. But Elias knew that his time was running out. The paradox was consuming him, erasing the version of events that had led to his existence. Through the haze of his fading memories, he looked up at his mother. She had stepped out of the transport pod, her expression a mix of confusion and relief. She glanced around, her gaze passing over him without recognition. In this timeline, he was a stranger to her, a man who didn't belong. And yet, in that moment, Elias felt a profound sense of peace. She was alive. She was safe. That was all that mattered. As his vision blurred, Elias felt the final threads of his existence slipping away. The stabilizer emitted one last pulse of light, and then there was silence. The timeline had been rewritten, the paradox resolved. And Elias Ardent, the man who had sacrificed himself to save his mother, was no longer a part of it. Elias opened his eyes to a world that was both familiar and foreign. The streetlights above him glowed faintly, casting long shadows across a city that seemed unchanged on the surface. But as he stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, he felt it, an absence, a gap in the fabric of existence that he couldn't quite name. He looked around, scanning the surroundings with an almost desperate need to orient himself. Everything appeared normal, yet he knew it wasn't. He had succeeded. He had rewritten the timeline. The stabilizer on his wrist was dark, its once persistent hum replaced by an empty silence. It had done its job, guiding him to the moment where history had been altered. But Elias was no longer tethered to that history. He wasn't sure if he had been erased entirely or if some fragment of his existence lingered in the shadows of this new reality. All he knew was that the world was continuing without him. The first sign of the ripple effects came as he turned the corner. There, across the street, was the small clinic where his mother had worked all those years ago. It was still standing, its doors open and bustling with patients and staff. For a moment, Elias hesitated, his chest tightening as he caught sight of her through the glass window. She was there, moving with purpose, her expression calm and focused. She looked just as he had seen her in the past, but now there was something different. The weight of grief that had defined her later years was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. She hadn't just survived, she had thrived. In this timeline, she hadn't faced the tragedy that had shattered her life and, by extension, his. She moved through the clinic with a confidence that spoke of years of uninterrupted work, her presence a source of comfort to those around her. Elias watched from a distance, his heart aching with a mixture of joy and sorrow. This was what he had wanted for her, what he had sacrificed everything to achieve. She was safe, alive, and free from the shadow of loss. But as he watched, he noticed something else, a young man stepping into the clinic. He wore a lab coat, his movements deliberate and precise as he approached a workstation. Elias's breath caught as he realized who he was looking at. It was him, or rather, a version of him. The man wasn't identical. His features were similar but not exact, as though shaped by a slightly different set of experiences. This was the scientist Elias might have become in a timeline where his mother had lived. The young man didn't seem aware of the enormity of his role in this new reality. He worked diligently, consulting data on a holographic display, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Elias felt a strange sense of detachment as he observed him. This man had no memory of the pain that had driven the original Elias to cross the boundaries of time. He didn't carry the weight of guilt or loss, nor the knowledge of the sacrifice that had made his existence possible. He was simply doing his job, contributing to a world that had been spared the chaos of temporal interference. Elias stepped back, blending into the flow of pedestrians as he tried to process the enormity of what he was witnessing. The timeline had realigned itself, filling the void he had left with new possibilities. His mother's life had continued uninterrupted, and in doing so, it had created a version of him that was entirely separate from the one who had made this journey. The universe had adapted, smoothing over the cracks and reshaping the story to fit the altered narrative. As he walked through the city, Elias began to notice more subtle changes. The streets were busier, the people more at ease. The ripple effects of his intervention had extended far beyond his mother. The small tragedies and disruptions that had resulted from her death, missed opportunities, fractured connections, unfulfilled potentials, had been erased, replaced by a reality that felt brighter and more cohesive. It wasn't perfect, no timeline ever was, but it carried a sense of balance that hadn't existed before. And yet, amidst the bustling life of the city, Elias felt the growing weight of his own absence. No one noticed him as he moved through the streets. No one turned to acknowledge his presence or recognized his face. He was a shadow, a remnant of a timeline that no longer existed. The memories of his life, the moments that had defined him, were gone, replaced by echoes of a reality that had moved on without him. As he approached a park near the center of the city, he paused to take it all in. Families walked along the paths, children laughed as they played, and the hum of the city's quantum-powered infrastructure created a steady rhythm in the background. It was peaceful, the kind of world he had always hoped to see but never thought he would be a part of. And now, he wasn't. He had become a spectator in a story he had rewritten. Elias looked down at the stabilizer on his wrist, its once brilliant display now dark and lifeless. It was a relic of the past, a tool that had served its purpose and now had no place in this new timeline. He reached up and removed it, the weight of the device a reminder of the journey he had taken. He set it down on a nearby bench, leaving it behind as he turned and walked away. The world continued to move around him, unaware of the man who had given everything to ensure its future. And as Elias disappeared into the crowd, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his sacrifice had mattered, even if no one would ever remember his name. Elias wandered through the city, a ghost in a world that no longer knew him. The stabilizer was gone, left behind on a bench as a discarded artifact of a timeline that had ceased to exist. The hum of the bustling streets, the laughter of children in the park, the quiet rhythm of life, it all surrounded him, but none of it acknowledged him. He felt the weight of his own absence, the unmistakable sense that he had become something less than real. He was here, and yet he wasn't. As he walked, the faint voice of Solis stirred in his mind, breaking the silence that had enveloped him. The AI, tethered to his neural interface, had survived the paradox, a relic of the choices he had made. Elias, Solis began, its tone steady but laced with an unusual gravity. The timeline has stabilized. Your intervention successfully prevented the critical event. Elias stopped, his gaze drifting to the horizon. Then why am I still here? He asked softly. I thought the paradox would erase me completely. Solis paused, as though carefully calculating its response. You exist as a temporal anomaly, a fragment of the original timeline. The universe, in its complexity, has adapted to your actions. Rather than collapsing under the weight of the paradox, it has created an alternative timeline, a stable reality where your presence was never required. Elias let the words sink in. A stable reality. That had been the goal all along, hadn't it? To fix the broken thread, to restore balance. And yet, standing there, he felt the hollowness of his own existence. So, I'm what, an afterthought? A mistake the universe didn't know how to erase. Not a mistake, Solis corrected. An inevitability. The nature of time is not absolute. When disrupted, it seeks equilibrium, often through the creation of branching realities. Your sacrifice ensured that equilibrium, but as the instigator of the paradox, you could not be fully absorbed into the new timeline. Instead, you persist as a fading echo. Elias closed his eyes, trying to grasp the magnitude of what Solis was saying. He was part of a story that no one would ever know, a remnant of a timeline that had been rewritten. The memories of his life, the choices he had made, they existed now only in fragments, stored within Solis's databank. What happens to me now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There is no precedent for your situation, Solis admitted. As a temporal anomaly, your existence is inherently unstable. Over time, you may fade entirely, or you may persist indefinitely as a fragment disconnected from the flow of causality. The outcome is uncertain. The uncertainty was both liberating and crushing. Elias had always lived with purpose, guided by a clear sense of direction. Now, he was adrift, unbound by the constraints of time, yet burdened by the knowledge of what he had lost. What about my memories? He asked. They're disappearing. I can feel them slipping away. Solis's voice softened, as though acknowledging the weight of his question. Your memories are tied to the timeline in which they were created. As that timeline no longer exists, your recollections are deteriorating, replaced by echoes of the new reality. However, I have retained a record of your original experiences within my databank. They remain intact, though inaccessible to you in their entirety. Elias felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, grief, perhaps, or the hollow ache of something irretrievably lost. His memories, the fragments of a life that had once defined him, were now just data points in a machine. They were no longer his. So, I'm just a story you're keeping alive? He asked, bitterness creeping into his voice. A story is not without value, Solis replied. Your actions reshaped the timeline, creating a reality where countless lives are better for your sacrifice. The echoes of who you were, the choices you made, remain within me as a testament to what you accomplished. While the world may not remember you, the impact of your existence persists. Elias let the words wash over him, their meaning both comforting and unbearable. He had given everything to save his mother, to create a world where she could live free of tragedy. And he had succeeded. But the cost had been higher than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just erased from the timeline, he was erased from himself. For a long moment, he stood in silence, watching the city continue its rhythm of life. The people moved through their routines, unaware of the temporal shifts that had shaped their reality. They didn't know him, and they never would. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps his purpose had been fulfilled. "Solis," he said finally, his voice steady. "If I'm going to fade, I want to know it meant something. I want to know she's happy." Solis was silent for a moment, as though considering the request. Then it replied, its tone resolute. "Your mother is alive, Elias. She has built a life full of meaning and joy. In this timeline, she knows no pain from the loss that once defined her. She is happy." Elias felt a faint smile tug at his lips, though it was tinged with sadness. "Then I can live with that. Or whatever this is." He turned away from the city, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he walked toward the horizon. He didn't know how much time he had left, or if time even held meaning for him anymore. But for now, he would keep walking, carrying the echoes of a life that no longer existed, guided by the quiet reassurance that his sacrifice had mattered. Elias walked onward, each step lighter than the last, though the weight of his journey lingered in his heart. He didn't know where he was going, perhaps he no longer needed to know. The city around him hummed with life, with the rhythm of people moving forward, their stories intertwined in ways they could never fully understand. Somewhere among them was his mother, alive and whole, living the life he had fought so hard to give her. The thought gave him a sense of clarity, a sense of quiet triumph, even as the edges of his existence continued to blur. He paused at a small park, a tranquil space tucked between the towering buildings. Children played on the grass, their laughter ringing out like music, and adults sat on benches, their conversations blending into the gentle hum of the city. Elias watched them, his gaze softening. These were the moments he had hoped to protect, the everyday lives of people who would never know how close they had come to unraveling. He hadn't just saved his mother. He had preserved a world where joy and connection could flourish. Solis's voice broke the silence, steady and calm. "Your actions have ensured the stability of this timeline, Elias. The paradox has resolved. The universe continues forward." Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. "And me?" he asked quietly. "What happens now?" "You are no longer bound to the timeline," Solis replied. "Your presence is an echo, sustained only by the residual effects of the stabilizer. Over time, you will fade, as all anomalies must." Elias took a deep breath, letting the reality of those words settle over him. He had known this from the moment he stepped into the past, from the moment he made the choice to rewrite history. This was always the price. And yet, standing here now, he didn't feel fear or regret. He felt calm. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the late afternoon light painted the sky in hues of gold and amber. "I thought I'd be angry," he admitted. "Angry that I wouldn't get to see what comes next. But I'm not. She's safe. That's all I ever wanted." Solis's voice softened, almost reverent. "Your sacrifice has ensured a better future, not just for her, but for countless others. The timeline has adapted, and your mother's life is one of happiness and fulfillment. She will never know the pain that once defined her existence." Elias smiled faintly, his hands slipping into his pockets as he leaned against the railing of a footbridge that overlooked the park. "She won't know me either," he said. "But maybe that's for the best. She deserves to live without shadows." He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the park wash over him. The fading echoes of his memories mingled with the present, creating a patchwork of moments that felt both distant and immediate. He remembered her laughter, her warmth, the way she had always managed to make him feel like he was enough. And now she would have the chance to give that same love and strength to others. She would live a life untouched by tragedy. The edges of his form flickered again, the dissonance growing stronger. Elias felt the pull, the gradual unraveling of his place in this world, but it didn't frighten him. If anything, it felt right. He had done what he set out to do. He had given her the gift of life, of hope, of a future free from the burdens of the past. As the fading grew more pronounced, he turned his thoughts inward, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy. He had faced impossible choices, crossed boundaries he once thought unbreakable, and given up everything he had ever known. And yet, in the end, he realized it had all been worth it. In the end, he said softly, his voice almost lost in the wind, the greatest gift I could give wasn't my existence, it was her happiness. Those words lingered in the air, carrying a weight that transcended time itself. As Elias took one final look at the world he had helped shape, a quiet peace settled over him. The park, the city, the lives he had touched, they would continue, vibrant and full, long after he was gone. And that was enough. With a final breath, Elias closed his eyes. The dissonance enveloped him completely, and his form dissolved into the air, leaving nothing behind but the faintest trace of a man who had once existed. The world moved on, unbroken and unaware, its rhythms steady and sure. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of a new timeline, a mother smiled, her life untouched by loss, her happiness a testament to the sacrifice of a man she would never know. Time is fragile, a delicate bundle of choices and consequences, where even the smallest change can ripple through existence. It is a force that binds us, defines us, and, at times, limits us. Yet, in its fragility lies its beauty, the profound connections we form, the moments that shape us, and the sacrifices we make for those we love. Elias Ardent understood this better than most. Faced with the unyielding rules of time and the weight of his own grief, he made a choice that few could fathom. He traded everything, his existence, his memories, his place in the world, for a single act of love. He stepped into the past, not to claim glory or rewrite his own destiny, but to save someone else. In doing so, he gave up the only thing he truly had, himself. His story is one of love's greatest cost. Elias didn't seek recognition or gratitude. His actions would never be recorded in history, his name never etched into the annals of time. He was a fleeting presence, a man who existed only to give others the chance to live fully. Yet, in the echoes of his sacrifice, there is a lesson that resonates across timelines. Would you trade your existence to save someone you loved? Would you risk everything to rewrite a single moment in history? Elias did, and while the world may never know him, his choice stands as a testament to the boundless depth of human love and the unyielding strength of hope. In the echoes of time, his sacrifice became a story worth remembering, not for what was lost, but for what was gained. The fragility of time reminds us that every decision carries weight. Each moment is a thread too vast for us to see in its entirety. Yet those threads, the ones we pull, the ones we weave, define the stories of our lives. Elias's story is one in a reality he will never know but ensured would flourish. Now, as you reflect on this tale, ask yourself, what would you do if you could rewrite history? Would you change a moment for yourself or for someone else? Would you risk the delicate balance of time for the chance to make things right? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the choices you might make. If you've been captivated by this story, if the mysteries of time and the human heart have drawn you in, subscribe to our channel. Here, we explore the endless possibilities of what could be and the timeless questions of what should be. And remember, time is a gift, a fragile and fleeting miracle. How you use it is the story only you can write. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in the infinite possibilities of the next story. If you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.